I miss Halloween. That's what I think to myself as I stare blankly about the empty stone walls. Only the bare essentials of toilet and what passes as a bed occupy the room aside from myself. Not even a blanket or sheet is present to fight off the cold. A deep chill that lays heavy in the cell makes my bare feet and face feel almost numb. The only illumination comes from the flicker of lights from the other side of the tiny window. It hangs at eye height in a door that serves as the only entrance in or out of my cell. The scratches marking the previous tenant's unstable or panicked mind line its perimeter, and it makes me shudder. I do my best to stave off the unease with memories of happier times. Halloween. Most of my happier memories are of Halloween. Every year I'd wait with bated breath for October to roll in and bring me the orange and blacks. I'd do my best as a kid to find as many opportunities to dress up or to do some sort of activity that held the Halloween spirit. It was such a fun and mysterious holiday in the eyes of an innocent child, and my mother did her best to make it even more special. Though it was just me and her, my father had passed away when I was still an infant. My mother would do her absolute best to accommodate me when it came to Halloween. Money was always tight, but when I was little, she still managed to piece together costumes for me from the most unconventional and cheap places. Eventually, she even taught me to make costumes myself, and I did just that every year. She would get me the fabric or materials, and then eventually, when I was old enough, I would buy them myself. She was so proud when I had shown her my first really well-done costume. So much so that she cried as much as she had done when I graduated high school. All of my first costumes were clearly amateur, and ventured on silly as opposed to scary, but this year, I had saved and managed to make a truly terrifying zombie outfit. She was so proud of me over it. She grabbed the zombie outfit that I had thrown together and danced with it. She jokingly said that when she passed away, she would want me to make her a costume to put into the ground with, just so she could be aptly dressed when she rose again during the inevitable zombie apocalypse. And I laughed and she laughed. And later that year, we discovered that she had cancer. And by the following Halloween, my mother had passed away. I wrapped up the costume and put it in her coffin, kissed her forehead, and told her forever sleeping face that she can put it on in her leisure. I came back to the present and found my eyes were filled with tears. I do my best to wipe them off as I hear commotion behind the cell's doors. I hear the orderlies walking about outside speaking amongst themselves in their native German. I look out through the small view allotted to me and take in the surroundings that I've grown accustomed to for almost a year. A sprawling dank of grays and white lines, the hallways, and seemingly always wet concrete floor are what I can see. I can barely make out the form of an orderly as well, a man dressed in white walking through the hallway. The hanging lights flicker away with inconsistent veils of darkness, give him the illusion that he's teleporting forward with each flash. I don't need to see to know that there's at least one more orderly in the hallway. There is always a guard standing outside of my line of sight and adjacent to my cell. I can hear him speaking with a raspy voice that spoke of 2 packs a day. In answer of a younger, albeit deeper voice of one of the incoming orderlies speaks. Very few words that I can understand, let alone grasp, but it sounds what I have come to know as the changing of the guard shift. And as I see the owner of the younger voice, I smile. He reminds me of someone I once knew. Someone who I'd met on a Halloween night. As I had grown older, the love for Halloween didn't stop. If anything, I got more and more wrapped up in it. Parties with the big kids turned into non-stop parties that would rage well into the morning hours. Street fairs with that sprawling across blocks with free-flowing booze and debauchery. And I myself, as self-absorbed as it sounds, had grown into quite the looker, and made those parties of debauchery ever so much more fun, if you know what I mean. All in the magical sense of Halloween, and I swear, there's some real magic in the air every year. Sure, there are plenty of mythological ties to the holiday from its roots such as shaman, but I don't mean that kind of magic. just the magic of fun, socializing, being someone else for a bit, or being everything you were just showing it on the outside. Hells, even the magic of love. I met my first boyfriend at one of those sprawling Halloween parties. I was introduced to a black-haired, blue-eyed man named Patrick, and he loved the holiday almost as much as I did. He was dressed as one of those massive locust scars from Gears of War, and he had done an amazing job on his costume. I'd gone as the Angel of Death, completely with nearly working wings. It was an amazing night that became the start of a long relationship. Every single year, we dressed up together and made the Halloween season our month-long macabre anniversary. A disgustingly happy duo enjoying the parties, events, haunted houses, and yes, even as adults, trick-or-treating. Granted, we were taking Patrick's niece out trick-or-treating when her mom couldn't, and we were just taking the opportunity to join in. Then almost a year ago, Patrick and I decided to do something different. We wanted to take a trip to Europe and visit creepy places all throughout the month of October that would eventually culminate in Paris on Halloween night. It was the most amazing trip at its beginning, having started in Amsterdam and then continuing on moving from hostel to hostel. We lost track of time practically and lost track of ourselves and our fun and laughter. I don't think that I had ever been happier. I was excited as it was as well to show off since I had painstakingly made us costume Hellraiser Cenobite costumes. So much work and, as you can imagine, love went into them. And then it all happened in a flash. I remember coming into Germany, discovering that in our trip that one of us had misplaced the costumes. I grew frantic in the hostel room that we had shared with several other people, and then I foolishly flew into an argument of blame. So furious was I that my voice rose and rose, and as I lifted the suitcase that should have only held our costumes and dumped its contents onto the floor. And then our roommates began to argue with me in his language. Dutch, I think. And amidst the lack of communication and the amassing anger, arguing soon rose into an altercation, and then all was red. And I snapped back into reality as a flash of lights shined on my face. The orderly is flashing his phone through the tiny window, and I can see the tiny and even familiar icons for his applications, and most importantly, I can see the date. It was October 30th at 11 p.m. And I smile as best as I can muster at him as he removes the phone and grins back at me. A handsome face with blue eyes and slightly messy black hair that had caught me off guard the first time that I'd seen him scan the rooms. The face that seems so much like Patrick's turns profile as he checks to ensure the other orderlies were gone. He says something that I don't understand, but I can tell its intent. I step away from the door and sit on the bed. Every night, that handsome face hated to be bothered with work, so he'd do his best to make certain that he wasn't going to be bothered. Every patient that I shared this hallway with knew full well what it meant to bother him. A vicious beating with a baton and a shot of sedative if they weren't knocked unconscious. I had been lucky on my first night here. I had been introduced into this ward the same night as another man. I was still reeling and still attempting to piece together everything that had put me here in a stunned silence by the other man that had no intention of being stoic. Instead, he raged and rattled in his cell, yelling and thrashing, causing every bit of ruckus that he could. But it was quickly silenced by the opening of his cell, and then the yelling and the thrashing turned to the sounds of flesh being beaten and screams of anguished pain. Then the cell door closed, followed by the handsome and slightly sweaty face coming to my window. He pressed his fingers to his lips and let out a silent shh. Every time a new patient would arrive, and he would have to teach them, and each time I remained silent as could be. Fearful silence. The same fearful silence had gripped me when I had realized what had happened that night. When the red haze of anger had finally subsided, I was being lifted off the ground. Several of the hostile occupants were dragging me out of the room, and I was covered head to toe in blood. I was terrified. I was confused, and I had no clue what was going on other than the terrified and angry faces looking back at me. I screamed Patrick's name over and over again. even as I was being dragged outside the building and greeted with flashing blue lights, and soon thrust into a police car. I screamed his name from beyond the windows until I saw the gurneys leaving the entrance. There I could see Patrick's body, limp, with a disgusting protrusion in his neck. His once handsome face, now terror-stricken, staring vacantly and lifelessly upwards. Tears flowing freely from my eyes, commingling with the blood that covered my face. My Halloween mask was that of a broken man held in a terrible frozen silence. Fearful, terrible silence. For almost a year since then. Fearful silence haunted by a face that so resembled Patrick's. Sitting here day in and day out, night in and night out, as I listened to others be beaten by that very face. Sitting here alone and bereft of anyone else in the world, save the madmen that are locked up, and the madmen who guard us. And I realize, on top of it all, I'm going to miss Halloween this year. For the first time in my life, I would not be celebrating October 31st. And for the first time since arriving here, I find no way to keep it in. I attempt to stifle a sudden sorrowful gasp, but tears are beginning to pour. My body is shaking. The weight of everything is finally pushing down on me so hard that I can't breathe. I don't want to be here. I want to be home. I want to be free. I realize I am sobbing loudly, but unable to control it. I need so desperately to be away from here. I want Mom. I want to show her every costume that I've made since she has been gone. And I hear shouting, but pay it no heed as I let the pour of emotion. I want Patrick. I want to go out with him dressed up in the streets. I want to be happy again. I hear the door open and the handsome orderly with his face walks in, shouting angrily, holding his baton. A flash of memory strikes me of the man who spoke Dutch yelling at me and Patrick. I want my Halloween back. And I leap at the orderly. I remember the Dutchman had thrown his first punch. I surprise the orderly as I make contact. I had ducked and the Dutchman had missed me and hit Patrick. Grabbing the orderly's head, I slam with full force towards the ground. I remember Patrick had fallen and hit his head with a sickening crunch against the bedpost and suddenly going limp. The orderly's skull makes a loud, sickening slap of flesh and bone meeting the concrete. I remember leaping at the Dutchman and slamming him to the ground. I grabbed the orderly's baton with a howl lifted into the air. I remember grabbing the scissors and bringing them down. And I slammed the baton into the orderly's face. I slammed the scissors into the Dutchman's chest. Again, I bashed the orderly's skull, and again I stabbed the Dutchman's chest. Bloody bits of bone and brain matter that once belonged to the orderly begin to spread across the floor with each wet strike of the baton. Blood, skin, and pulpy meat fly up in sloppy chunks as I drive the sharp instrument into the Dutchman's chest. And again the orderly. Again the Dutchman. Again and again. The Dutchman, the orderly. Simultaneously, I see them both in my vision, the Dutchman's bloody chest and the orderly's bloody skull. The Dutchman, the orderly. Then only a bloody mess of teeth and hair fill my sight as I am brought fully into the present. I heave in gasps and raged breath as I find that I am slamming the baton on concrete. I find that I had been weeping while destroying this man. And as I wipe the tears from my eyes, I realize that my cheeks and corners of my mouth hurt. I I'd been smiling as well. I pick myself up and I look down at the orderly's carcass on the ground, and a thought comes to mind. I tear off the clothes and replace them with mine. Grabbing the keys he had on the baton, I leave the cell and walk down the hallway. I smile and I wipe the last remaining tears off my face as I walk past each silent cell and unlock them. Each one was done, and each lunatic began to emerge from their dark isolation, and I turned my attention to the exit. I walked purposely to it in my hastily but together costume. I can't help but smile and think, Happy Halloween. To me. For the most wild, yet mostly homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet, mad am I not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburthen my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In these consequences, these events have terrified, and have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little but horror. To many, they will seem less terrible than Baroque's. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances I detail with awe nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy, I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals. I was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spend most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood, I derived it from one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasions to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black and sagacious to an astounding degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regard all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mention that matter at all for no matter reason than it happens, just now, to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted, and in this manner, for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, and more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when by accident or through affection they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol? And at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. And one night, returning home, much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, when in his fright at my violence, he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me, and I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed, at once, to take its flight from my body in more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilling every fiber of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, and grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes out from the socket. I blush, and I burn, and I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror and half of remorse for the crime of which I had been guilty. But it was, at best, a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excuses and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of the creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, a spirit, a perverseness. Of this spirit philosophy takes no account. Yet I am not more sure that my soul lives. That I am the perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not, 100 times, found himself committing a vile or silly action, for no other reason than because he knows that he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury that I had inflicted upon the offending brute. And one morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree. Hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes, and with the bitterest remorse of my heart. Hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason of offense. Hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin. A deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. On the night of the day in which the cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flame. The whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of facts, and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had here, in great measure, resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to having been recently spread. About this wall a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seeming to be examining a particular portion of it with very minute and eager expression. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did not the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I would not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period, there came back into my spirit a half sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look upon me, among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented, for another pet of the same species, and of somewhat similar appearance, with which to supply its place. And one night as I sat, half stupefied in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object, reposing upon the head of one of those immense hogsheads of gin or of rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of the hogshead for several minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. And I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of the breast, and upon touching him, he immediately rose, purring loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I had once offered the purchase of it of the landlord, but the person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never even seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded, and when I reached the house it domesticated itself at once, and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed. But slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame and the resemblance of my former deed of cruelty, preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise violently ill use it. But gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with utterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence, as from the breath of pestilence. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was the discovery on the morning after I brought it home that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed in a high degree the humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait. and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a persinicity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caress. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and nearly throw me down, or fastening its long and sharp claws to my dress, clamber in this manner to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from so doing, partially by memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss of how otherwise to define it. I'm almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to own that the terror and the horror with which this animal inspired me had been highlighted by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair, of which I had spoken and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one that I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful. It had at length assumed a rigorous distinctiveness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster that, had I dared, it was now, I say, the image of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. Oh, mournful and terrible engine of horror and crime, of agony and of death. And now was I indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast, whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me a man, fashioned in an image of the high God, so much of insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night I knew the blessing of rest any more. During the former the creature left me to no moment alone, and in the latter I started hourly from dreams of utterable fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. And beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates. The darkest and the most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and all mankind. And while from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the step stairs, nearly throwing me headlong, exasperating me into madness. Uplifting an axe and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished, but this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe into her brain. She fell dead upon the spot, and without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith, and with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. At one period, I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it by the floor of the cellar. And again, I deliberated about casting it into the well in the yard, about packing it into a box, as if merchandise with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. and finally hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this cellar was well adept. Its walls were loosely constructed and had lately been plastered throughout the rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection caused by a false chimney, a fireplace that had been filled up and made to resemble the red of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar, I easily dislodged the brick, and, having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while, with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as if it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair with every possible caution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I very carefully went over to the new brickwork. And when I finished, I felt satisfied that I was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly, and I said to myself, "Here at last, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it at that moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate, but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed of the violence of my previous anger and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus for one night at least, since its introduction to the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not, and once again I breathed as a free man. The monster in terror had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. And upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came, very unexpectedly, into the house, and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatsoever. The officer bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored, and at length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one with slumbers and innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say it but one word, by the way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allied your suspicions. I wish you all health, and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house." In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. "I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together." And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which I held in my hand, and upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. Oh, may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberations of my blow sunk into silence than it was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry at first muffled and broken, like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, uttering anomalies and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of a horror and half of triumph, such as might be arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, and the demons that exult in the damnation. Of my own thoughts it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall, and for one instant the party upon the stairs remained motionless, through extremity of terror and of awe, and in the next a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had co-signed me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb.